What's up, everybody? This is Charlie Potter, senior team writer with BamaOnLine.com, and we got a basketball show for you this morning. Joined by Tim Watts and Blake Byler, two hoops nuts over at BOL, and I was kind of judged or ridiculed for the timing of this one, coming off the loss to Ole Miss. But hey, that means we'll have plenty to talk about. So we are now 17 games through the SEC basketball season, and Alabama's 14-3. They haven't lost a game since November, so it's kind of a weird place to be because Alabama had been on a nice little roll at the start of conference play, but lost to Ole Miss 74-64 at Coleman Coliseum on Tuesday night. Very animated Nate Oates in post game. I think it took a while to get to me for a question because I was on the far side of the room, but he flat out said it was disgusting and said it with some poison in his voice. So I'm going to get these guys' thoughts on the loss, and then we're going to kind of make our way through some topics. But with that in mind, Tim, do you share the same opinion with Nate? Did you think it was disgusting, or did you view it a different way?
I thought it was the effort, I think, is what surprised me and everybody. They just looked lethargic. Now, I will say, not to really make excuses, but they got in pretty late from that Texas A&M game, probably 3 or 4. I don't think they 3 or 4 a.m. I don't think they practiced on Sunday to let their legs rest. So they're playing, back-to-back games in a 40-hour window, two good opponents. But I mean, part of this I think could be a little bit tired. But I think a part of it, and this happens with basketball, basketball will humble you. That's why, you got that Indiana undefeated team. It's hard to do this. It's hard to do this. You get humbled so quickly. You're winning 7 in a row or whatever it was. You're feeling yourself. Big win at Texas A&M. You let up, and obviously one team was extremely hungry. Ole Miss was starving, and Alabama looked like they had just finished Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, and Alabama's down to 9 scholarship players. Darion Reed was out with an injury. We know Latrell Wrightsell's been out all season. Houston Millett continues to be out with his knees. So they were down to 9. That's not a huge excuse, but something to keep in mind too, just in terms of the quick turnaround. And I personally don't love the Tuesday night games. I'd rather them be on Wednesday. It just kind of spaces out your week a little better.
I
And I'm
agree.
sure Nate and the players feel the same way. But for you, Blake, when we were sitting in Coleman Coliseum, when the final buzzer sounded, just what was your takeaway and impression of that loss to Ole Miss?
I mean, it was just a bad game, bad effort all around, and it was kind of like the perfect storm of bad things kind of all happening at once. Because you go down the list and you kind of look at the stats, 21 turnovers, which was a season high, and obviously not a winning formula at all. But then you combine with that they only shot 25% from three, and they haven't been a great three-point shooting team this year, but they've still been in like the 32-33% range throughout the year. So 25% is still well below what their average is. On top of that, you had Ole Miss getting, I think, 23 more shot attempts throughout the game, and Alabama only getting 3 offensive rebounds. You technically 4, but I think they credited Jaron Stevenson with an offensive rebound when he hung on the rim and got called for a goaltend. So you don't really count that one. That's only 3 offensive rebounds, and I think one of them came on like within the last minute of the game. And so this is a team who has been top 10, top 15 in offensive rebounding rate throughout the season. It's been kind of one of their calling cards on offense, and that there was no presence on the offensive glass at all. You had a lot of turnovers, but a lot of it wasn't even what Ole Miss was doing defensively. A lot of it was just careless, like just leaving your feet, not knowing where you're going to go with the ball, throwing the ball into passing lanes that aren't there, that are really tight, that are just ill-advised passes, dribbling the ball with your foot, whatever it may be. So when you have all of these things combined with the effort problem that you talked about, Tim, like you're going to have a bad game. And the result was 64 points, which is Alabama's lowest scoring point total in a game since the Sweet 16 loss to San Diego State 2 years ago. So it's been almost 2 full years since they had an offensive performance that bad. And just everything down the line offensively was horrible. But I don't think it's a thing where, like, I don't think this is indicative of a lot moving forward. It looks more, and you can look at the data from this year that we've seen, like this looks more like a statistical outlier compared to how we've seen the team play so far. And I've seen people overreacting and being like, oh, the offense is terrible. Like they're not going to be able to do anything, whatever. Like the 3 games in SEC play leading into this, they scored 107, 88, and 94. Like they were
Yeah.
playing good basketball going into this game. This was a bad game, but we don't have to make it more than what it was. Like, it was a bad game, but now we have to see how they respond moving forward from this.
You want me to tell you why I think that is real quick? Sorry, Charlie, is
Be
that
good.
you go from playing with house money going into Kentucky, right? House money, 4-0, got us a big road win. And now it feels like you're gambling your rent money. You don't want to lose 2 in a row. All of a sudden you went from 4-0, possibly 4-1 to possibly 3-2. So from a fan perspective and probably a Nate Oates perspective, I see the pressure. You went from got a little room to play with to, we really gotta do well.
Yeah, and I think just the fan reaction too, when you have Nate saying the things he's saying in the post-game press conference, I think fans are probably happy to see that, because you're coming off a football season with Kalen DeBoer, and Kalen's a guy that he's level-headed. He doesn't say anything really to anything negative about his team, and Nate was spitting it in his post-game press conference. So I think that's where you see a lot of the worry and maybe some of the overreaction. It helps some of that, at least in my opinion. But with this game, and I agree with Blake that it's more of an anomaly than what could be a trend. But is there a big concern for you just looking at the stats and what happened on the floor from this game? Because for me, I think the 21 turnovers stands out the most, because like Blake said, they've been a not great shooting team, but they've had worse shooting performances, this season, at least from three, or at least something similar. But the 21 turnovers and the way that they turned them over a lot of times, because it wasn't necessarily a lot of what Ole Miss was doing. It was a lot of Alabama forcing things. That to me is maybe the biggest concern and something you want to clean up. But what about you, Tim? What's your biggest concern, or is there a big concern coming out?
I don't have a major concern. I just think this is a team that's going to have to stay humble, and that's basically any good team. Because like we said, look at what happened to Oregon. That's a humbling moment. You're rolling through that, cashing your check, you're already spending your NIL money, and then they played better, but still that was a winnable game from Alabama. So I think there's a confidence. When you go with confidence, you can find a laziness or you can be too relaxed, I guess what I'm saying. I think, LeBaron ran into that this week. Just didn't have a great game. A lot of confidence coming. He was really celebrating coming off the Aggie court. He's putting them to sleep and waving goodbye. And he's a young guy. So that's a learning moment for him. Definitely not a game we expect from him. But I don't have major concerns with this team. I don't remember many teams that just cruise through. I'd have to go back to like UNLV, Jerry Tarkanian team, and then they lost in the finals. So there's just not a lot of cruise through everything. But if it becomes a trend, I think we're having a different discussion. But turnovers have been an issue, lack of shooting. I mean, 2 big missed free throws in that game. Little basic things. You still got to be talented. They are, but you still want to be blue collar with this group, in my opinion.
No doubt. And I think they're a little better from the free throw line. I still think they shot under 75%, which I think you want to raise that up. But I'm glad you brought up LeBaron, because he's someone that hasn't been great of late. I mean, he went 0 of 8 from the floor. I think he only scored 1 point. And Nate Oates was asked about him specifically in postgame, and he mentioned it. And he was talking about the whole team, but it's interesting that he brings it up. Just the getting in the gym and working on your game yourself. And I think that's something as a young guy coming in that he has to learn. But with guys like Mark Sears and Grant Nelson and some of these veterans on the team, that should be, I think, in my opinion, already instilled in him from seeing them do that. So I think that if that's something that he continues to bring up as the season goes on, that could develop into a bigger concern. But I don't think that they're going to have any lack of getting in the gym this week, at least if Nate Oates has anything to say about it. But what about you, Blake? Is there a big concern coming off this? Or, and obviously we're going to talk about the Kentucky game, and that's for a little bit down the road in terms of a couple days. But is there a concern that this could leak over into one or multiple games?
I think the biggest concern for me has been shooting, and I think that's kind of been the way it's been all season. I think the turnovers definitely a problem in that game, but I mean, in the couple games leading up, I think they were hovering around like 8 to 12 turnovers a game over the past 4 or 5 games, which isn't the best number ever, but it's also not 21. Like it's a much more acceptable rate, and obviously they can win games with the turnover rate like that. But the shooting has been a little bit more of an issue, and that's obviously you lost Latrell Wrightsell, who's your best shooter. to a season-ending injury. And now it looks like you're losing Houston Millette probably for the season. And he's also been one of your better shooters. And so that leaves, as far as pure shooting goes, you have Mark Sears, you have Aiden Holloway, who have both been fantastic. And then your third guy is probably Chris Youngblood, who has taken a little while to get his feet under him after the ankle surgery and kind of working his way back, getting back in shape. He shot better over the last couple of games. But I think on the season, he's still hovering around that 28% mark. When for his career, he's closer to a 40% shooter. So as he and Sears, they both had poor starts. As they start to hit shots at a high rate, I think it'll be better. But outside of that, you don't have a ton of shooting. Like Reed is not really a shooter. Filan's not really a shooter. Like they can make one, but you don't want these guys shooting 5-6 attempts a game. Same with Stevenson, Nelson, guys like that. So getting good performances shooting wise from Sears, Holloway, and Youngblood are going to be really important moving forward. And you've got to make sure those are the guys that you're getting taking the most attempts, especially against a team like Kentucky, which we'll talk about later. But that's a team with a defense that I think can be gotten a little bit.
Charlie, real quick, I just want to touch on one thing I don't think we're doing enough, and I know you both agree, so it's not – I just want to mention Chris Beard's a hell of a coach. You know what I mean? That is a dang good – that's a good team, knew what it had to do. So they kind of forced Alabama in some ways. I think they hit them, and you kept – I don't know about y'all. Well, I do know this. Didn't you keep waiting for that run? 11-3 run, up 5, and then extend. They refused. I mean, they were running down layups off turnovers. They were challenging everything. So I think you got to give – big man played like – he played like Wemby. He played like a lottery choice. I mean, he was very dominant. Huge play in that game to me was when Grant blocked him. He got it back, went right up over Mo and Grant and a and one. Just a huge move. So we want to give, obviously, I know y'all agree, Chris Beard, great coach, motivated team, going to be closer to that top 10 probably in this next ranking if they keep going. But I think that was part of it. And then you mix in, hey, look how good we are. And that was just a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, Ole Miss is like a top 15, top 20 team. They're first place in the SEC right now, tied with Auburn. Like that's
Agreed.
A good basketball team that they lost to. This isn't the Ole Miss of 3 or 4 years ago with Kermit Davis as head coach. You didn't lose to that team at home. It's still not good to lose at home, but like Ole Miss is a solid team. Doesn't excuse the loss, but it's not a bad team that they lost to at all.
No, Malik Dia had 23 points, 19 rebounds. He had just as many offensive boards as Alabama did as a team. So you're right. I mean, I think there is credit where credit's due, and Nate Oates did plenty of that in his post-game press conference. But I think it's both you lost and you got beat kind of situation. There's signs of both, and I think that's important when you look at this game coming up against Kentucky. A similar kind of situation. You go into the game with the same records. Kentucky's going to be, I think, 8th in the country when you look at the AP poll, so a top 10 matchup in Lexington. And Kentucky's not, they're not invulnerable. They've lost to a Georgia team that I think is better than people expected. When you look at the SEC, they've lost to Clemson on the road. Who else did they lose to? Ohio State. Yeah, they got spanked. They got spanked by Ohio State.
Surprising,
it's going to be a challenge to go up to Lexington. So that's where we're going to kind of shift gears. Just what are your expectations for this team going up to Kentucky this weekend, Tim? And do you think they can bounce back?
Yeah, I think they've had 2 losses and played a ranked team after both the losses, came back and won by double digits twice against pretty good basketball teams. I mean, I think they've proven that. I think this week will be a long week with Nate Oates in your ear. You know what I mean? You've been embarrassed. This is a prideful team. Mark Sears, you got a lot of age on this team. Phelan having the rookie mistakes, which they all do, the freshman moments, the freshman games, we're all used to that. We saw Ryan Williams in football have drops. That's just what, sometimes freshmen do. But to have the older guys have to listen to this, I think they'll be as hard on themselves as Nate Oates will. I think you go in a very formidable opponent. Mark Pope's a good coach. They got a good roster. They got some experience. They had to put together a whole new team. But like you said, they're beatable. So Alabama might thrive, and they kind of do, based on what they did with the Aggies to me. They kind of like being the villain. They kind of like coming in, everybody's booing us. Brandon Miller thrived on getting booed. You know what I mean? And finding that inner challenge of, oh, you've insulted me, even though, nobody's insulted you. But I think they go in, and I know they're going to play hard. I know that's 1,000%. I don't think win and loss is necessarily the end-all be-all in this game.
Yep.
It's showing us again, are you going to bounce back every time you struggle? Because that's what this season still got how many games left? It's still got double the games they've played left. They've still got at least 17 games. So show us what you can do. Give us that effort, what you're expecting. You should be a little bit humble after what happened, but you're also old enough to know, hey, we're good enough to compete.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that part about the way that they played after losses against ranked competition, because you look at the other losses on the schedule, they lose on the road at Purdue, which that was a tough game, probably the toughest on the schedule just in terms of where it was. And then they bounce back and beat a top 25 Illinois team in Birmingham. They lose to Oregon in that final game out in Vegas, and then they bounce back and win on the road at North Carolina in impressive fashion. So I don't know if the trend necessarily continues, because this is going to be a tough game, but you like the way that they've bounced back. And like you said, I'm sure this week in practice, it's going to be a tough one on these guys. And I think those veterans, the Mark Sears, the Grant Nelsons of the world, the Chris Youngbloods, I think this is a big week for Chris Youngblood. I'm sure he'll be on his guys as hard as the coaching staff, just the way that he stepped up from a leadership standpoint. But when you look at this Kentucky team, Blake, how do you think Alabama matches up, and what are they getting into when they go up to Rupp on Saturday?
Look, Kentucky's good. Mark Pope's a really good coach. They've got a good offense. I'm looking at their KenPom page. They've got the number 2 offense right now after Alabama's slipped from number 2, I think, to number 9, but it's a really slim margin.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got a really good offense. They've shot the ball really well this year. Their defense hasn't been very good, to be quite honest. I mean, defensive efficiency wise, they're at number 74th overall. But the number that really sticks out to me is Kentucky's like bottom 4th or bottom 5th in the country in forced turnover rate defensively. And so we know this team has struggled with turnovers. They just had 21 against Ole Miss. That could be an area where they can get cleaned up a little bit, where this is a Kentucky defense that doesn't force a lot of turnovers. And on top of that, Kentucky has allowed a lot of points in SEC play. You look at their very first, I think this game could be decently similar to their very first game in SEC play when they hosted Florida and won the game 106-100. I don't know if this game is going to be that high scoring, but like you could have that kind of shootout on hand. I think Alabama has obviously a much better defense than Kentucky does, and I think they can compete. I think this is a winnable game overall. Yeah. I mean, the KenPom projects the spread as a 1-point favorite for Kentucky, which means it's right there, like home court being kind of the difference in that spread. Two pretty even teams. But obviously, like Tim said, I don't think win or lose is super important here. Like a loss isn't the end of the world. It's not the end of your season. Like this is a game that technically you're supposed to lose going on the road to play a tough Kentucky team. Like going into this SEC season, we all probably factored this game as a loss. Now, funnily enough, I feel better about this game than I would have, honestly, had they won on Tuesday night. Because now, like you said, with the seniors and the leaders on this team, like you're probably going to see they're going to use this as a wake-up call. Nate Oates is going to be on them all week. You have a lot of fifth-year seniors on this team. And that's something Nate Oates even brought up in his press conference after Ole Miss, was that he was kind of disappointed in the fifth-year leaders with how many they have, that they would come out in a game like that and be as lack of effort and as disappointing as they were. So I expect those guys to be on it this week. I expect kind of just a whole much better performance from an effort standpoint. And honestly, if you see that, and if they go out and they play with a ton of effort and they play hard, and it's not a lack of effort being the reason that they lost, you can live with that and you can move on, because you know you don't have an effort problem every game moving forward. I think winning it almost nullifies the loss on Tuesday. If they do somehow, not somehow, but if they do go into Rupp and get a win, then that kind of erases the sting of Tuesday, and you're right back there in the SEC race. If you lose it, you might need some help later on, but it's still early. It's the middle of January, and like we've seen in the SEC, stuff is crazy. I mean, you saw Florida lose a home game to Missouri like 2 nights ago. So as far as the SEC race goes, stuff is crazy. But getting a win would be huge and kind of erasing the sting of Tuesday night.
Yeah, the SEC is nuts. You only got 2 teams that are undefeated in conference play. And, that's Auburn, and who's the other one? Ole Miss.
Ole Miss, yeah.
So
Ole Miss.
it's a wild year. So, and this is a wild show because whenever I planned it, I think we weren't going to be talking about a loss to Ole Miss, so we started off with that. And the initial plan was to kind of look at the first half of the season because we're going to do this on more of a weekly basis moving forward. Now that a lot of the things with football are done, thank God, the portal's closed. The the NFL draft deadline has passed, so a little less football to cover, and we're going to talk a little more hoops. But I wanted to kind of just get y'all's thoughts kind of quickly this last 10 minutes or so on just the first half of the season overall. So, Tim, what's been your biggest takeaway through these first 17 games as Alabama really starts to enter the meat of its SEC schedule?
The negative to me is I really thought this would be a better shooting team. We saw them at practice a few times. They get in the reps. This is not an issue of it's not a focus. They're getting in the reps. Everybody, I saw Cliff shoot 20 plus 3 points in a practice. So, these guys are going to shoot. So I'm a little disappointed from that standpoint, but the positive is killer schedule, 3 losses with this schedule. I know some fans go piece by piece when they're judging. Like every scene in the movie, they're like, this sucks. Oh, it's the greatest movie ever. I kind of like start to finish evaluate it. Mm-hmm. And I would say if we're at the intermission at the halfway point, I think Alabama's about where we expected. They've got wins we didn't expect. How many people expected them to go into North Carolina at the start of the season and win handily, by the way? So you had that Houston. You got this loss. It's not, again, Alabama's losses tend to be better losses than you realize at the time, right? Oregon, they lost to Oregon. Oregon's not a bad basketball team. So there's, they don't have a terrible loss right now. But I tell you one thing as far as the pleasant surprise, Aiden Holloway. Don't tell me this guy can't play basketball. We're going to, there was a lot of slander thrown his way. And I know he didn't have a great, and that was nothing against Bruce Pearl, who's a terrific coach. Wasn't a great fit. A lot of slander thrown his way about him not being good. But I'll be damned if he's not good. He's smooth. He's easy. He's a team player. There was a lot of discussion about him pouting. I don't see any of that. He's adjusted to his role. He's moved up constantly in minutes. He's played well. High five. You can see he fits in really well with what that team does. Glad Chris Youngblood is back. But the injuries, I really hurts me for Trelly especially. Houston's been dealing with those knees for a while, but to lose Trelly. But overall, I'm happy with the basketball season. It's about, I don't know what I would have predicted if you said predict the first up to this point, but it probably would have been 2 losses, maybe 3 losses at least.
Yeah, it's a tough schedule. NATO's scheduled like an NBA team. It feels like he should have, the Celtics or somebody on there the way that he does it. So to come out of that 14-2, they hadn't lost a game since that Thanksgiving week before this Ole Miss game. So they've been playing well. What about you, Blake? What's your big takeaway from the first half of the season so far?
Yeah, I think the resume, like y'all kind of mentioned, is in a really, really good spot with the performance that they had in non-conference and your 2 losses being to Purdue and Oregon. Oregon has ended up being a really good team, like a top 15, top 20 caliber team. And then Ole Miss obviously being pretty good coming off that loss. Like all of your losses are quad 1 losses to good teams. Like you haven't suffered a bad loss. And then you have a lot of good wins. Houston, really good team who lost a couple games early, but they've done nothing but climb. And I think they're in the top 10 now and will be a major player in the Big 12. Illinois has been way better than I think we thought they were going to be after that game in Birmingham when I think they were 25th. And now they're like top 10 in the net, top 10 in KenPom, like a really good team, maybe the best team in the Big 10 with Illinois. And then you got the road win at North Carolina. The road win at Texas A&M, I think, is one of the best wins of the season. So the resume is in a good spot. I think you have 4 quad 1 wins at this point in the season, which is up there with some of the higher quad 1 win numbers in college basketball. You only have quad 1 losses. Like you're in a great spot as far as seeding goes for the NCAA tournament down the line, as long as you continue to hold serve and play well in conference. And also, even with the loss to Ole Miss, they're still right in the thick of things for the SEC regular season title and for getting a good seed for the SEC tournament. They're just in a great spot overall with their performance. And it hasn't always looked the prettiest. It hasn't always been the most aesthetically pleasing with maybe a couple of the wins early on. I remember the Rutgers game or things like that, but you still won the games and you still find yourself in a great spot sitting here in mid-January with a great resume and a chance to, I think in most bracketologies right now, they're sitting as a 2 seed, and I think they were a 1 seed before that Ole Miss game. Like that's a great spot to be in moving forward with a lot more opportunities ahead of you too.
Yeah, Tim jumped the gun a little bit earlier. I was going to ask about your surprise players, and he mentioned Aiden Holloway. That's probably the guy for most of us. I think that he's played really, really well of late. I think last 5 or 6 games scored in double figures. I think he was really, I don't want to say the lone bright spot, but he was the brightest spot from an individual standpoint in this past game. And like you said, he's been a team player. He's someone that Nate Oates has spoken highly of since the summer, since he got here on campus. So it's I think for him, I think that's been a big surprise. I also think LeBaron Philon, if you kind of erase the last 3 games, maybe the way that he's played and just asserted himself as a starter and a guy that's going to be a lottery pick potentially whenever the season's over. That's been a big and pleasant surprise as well. But Tim, do you want to say anything more about Aiden or LeBaron or anybody else that's kind of surprised you this year?
No, I think those are the 2. I think that you're right. I jumped the gun. I'm just always ahead of you. But you're always chasing Timmy. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Blake. Share some of your thoughts.
I mean, I would have gone with one of those 2 guys, either Holloway or Philon. I think Aiden Holloway is probably pushing for an SEC 6 Man of the Year award type season with the way he's playing. I mean, the way he's been shooting, he's been Alabama's best shooter by a decent margin this season, and he's only got better too. Like I think he was hovering around the kind of mid to low 30s at the start of the year, and now he's up to 39%. And I think since about the middle of December, he's closer to 42 or 43%. His shooting is great. I think he's probably the most comfortable any Alabama fan has taking a shot right now. And that's been great to see. The thing that's really impressed me though has been his finishing at the rim. Like a year ago, I think he was in the 30s percentage wise as far as his 2-point field goal percentage, and now he's in the 60s. Like that's an insane jump from year 1 to year 2, and he looks great. He's fast off the bounce. He pushes the pace probably better than any other Alabama guard does. He's just so quick on the floor. And I think his defense has improved over the course of the season. He still gets beat from time to time, but I think the effort has been better from him there. He doesn't have the frame to be an elite defender at the guard spot. He's just too small. But he's been better on that side of the ball. I think Nate Oates gave him a shout out for that after that game. And so, I mean, it's been great to see him. I didn't know going into the season how much that he was necessarily going to play, just with how many good guards this team had and how good LeBaron Philon has been throughout this season. But it's been great to see that with Philon hitting kind of a freshman wall of sorts the last couple games to start SEC play, you've needed a guy to step up, and that guy's been Holloway. So that's been great to see. He's been great off the bench for them.
Yeah, averaging over 20 minutes a game. So I think that could continue to climb if he keeps playing like this. And our last one, just with, now you have 14 games left in SEC play, still a lot of basketball to be played. Just who do you want to see more from down this final stretch, Tim, whenever Alabama is hopefully going to bounce back from this loss? Who do you want to see more from moving forward?
I really want to see Cliff. I mean, I hope he gets, healthier. I mean, you saw the lack of Cliff Tuesday night. You saw the difference. I mean, Grant just gets that, he had 5 turnovers. He gets a little out of whack because he's having to do so much. He's obviously more comfortable at the 4 and defending the 4. And that guy was a monster. I'm not saying Cliff, but Cliff's length can change that. I'd like to see him be a little bit more aggressive. We've seen it in flashes, and it's not like he's having a bad year, but I just think that there's more, especially in that low post with the defense, and to relax and give Grant a little bit more opportunity because, I mean, Grant looked a little flustered to me, and you know how some players are really affected on one end, on the other end. So if you're struggling defensively, you get dunked on. Not saying Grant did, but you can go down and go over 6 on the other end of the floor. It's just in your head mentally because basketball players, a lot of them feed off that energy, and I think Grant's one of them. So Cliff, I'd like to see a little bit more. Chris, I want to see the Chris that we think he's going to be once he gets all the rust completely off of him.
Yeah, I think Nate Oates even said after the game he wished he would have played Cliff a little bit more against Ole Miss. So I don't think you're alone in that. What about you, Blake? Who's someone you want to see more from down this second half?
There's a couple of directions I feel like you could go with this, especially after Tuesday night. I think Cliff is one of them. I think we've mentioned Phylon and kind of the wall he's hitting. I'd like to see a little more from him. Youngblood, I think he's shooting better over the last couple of games. I think in SEC play, even though he just went 2 for 8 the other night, I think 3 of those were late in the game when the game was out of hand. I think he's closer to 35% since SEC play started, which is nice. But I want to see more of Darion Reed. I want him to be healthy for one.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's missed, I think, 2 of the last 4 or 5 games with an injury. And whenever he plays, he doesn't always score a ton. He's not always in double figure scoring, but he affects the game in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And he's such a smart player. He hustles. He's one of the better perimeter defenders on the team. I think his presence and his toughness were missed on Tuesday night. And obviously, I don't know if the outcome changes whether he plays or not, but he's a guy who gets in there and does the dirty work. He gets offensive rebounds. He hustles. He plays defense. Like that's a guy who will be important, especially coming up. I'm interested to see if he plays against Kentucky, but I think he's played really good basketball for Alabama this season. But as far as seeing more from him, I just want him to be healthy and be on the floor because he's definitely a guy that is missed when he's not out there.
I thought of Reed too when I wrote this down, and you're right. Just from an availability standpoint, that's kind of where you sit with him. But I think both of you mentioned him. I think Chris Youngblood. He's played in 8 games and he's averaged over 21 minutes a game. Those minutes are climbing for him. And Natos mentioned it after the A&M game about how he mentioned the conference player of the year coming over from South Florida. Like he's starting to look like his old self again. I think the rust is probably 85, 90% off, if not more. But I think we're still waiting on that big game from Chris Youngblood. And he had a big game at A&M. If he can, kind of build off that, I think he can be really big for this team moving forward. And I think they need that because we talked about kind of the shooting woes. He's shown he's capable of knocking some shots down, but I think he needs to do it on a more consistent basis. So I think they get that from him. I think if they get more from Cliff and we get more of Darion Reed, I think Alabama will be better off for it. But that's going to do it, guys. First basketball show in the books. I know we did one before the season, but more so what we're going to do from a weekly basis moving forward. Hope everyone listening enjoyed it. If you did, give us a thumbs up, like this, subscribe to the channel. If you're listening via podcast, give us 5 stars and a rating and a review. We'd appreciate it greatly. And hopefully next week we have a better game to recap, a better stretch. Maybe not a game with 21 turnovers or maybe the foul fest that we saw in College Station. So appreciate you guys being here. Appreciate you guys for listening, and we'll catch you guys on the next show.